So good evening, everyone. We are going to finish today, as Hashem, we're going to finish Siman Zayin of Iggeres HaKodesh, and then we will continue on after that to Siman Ches. So what we've learned so far in the Siman Iggeres HaKodesh is that the divine energy that enters this world is divided, generally speaking, into 613, but more particularly, it divides into a countless amount of sparks, and every single spark enters and corresponds to one yid, and also every single one of these sparks corresponds to a certain mitzvah or a detail of a mitzvah. And 2 + 2 = 4. So when you put these two pieces of information together, the conclusion we arrive at is that every single one of us has a particular and unique bond with a specific mitzvah, which is why the Alter Rebbe brings down from the Gemara where it says, Avuch b'may havizahar tvei. That one Amoira asked by another, your father, what was the mitzvah that he was most careful with? Obviously he was careful with all the mitzvahs. But his question was, which mitzvah does he have that special connection with? And therefore he is especially careful about that particular mitzvah. And as we spoke last week, this is something which we see by all real Yidden, that there's always something, you have the famous story about Yosef Meiker Shabbos. Mm-hmm. Now obviously Yosef Meiker Shabbos was a from a Yid, and obviously he was Mahader b'mitzvahs in all mitzvahs. Nevertheless, he was known as Yosef Meiker Shabbos. He obviously felt a very strong connection to the mitzvah of Shabbos. Sorry, what did you say?
Avram Fried.
It's okay. I think also, I think it precedes Avram Fried, the story. Yeah. And the same thing is for every single one of us. If we want to know what is my unique special bond with Hashem, my little spark of Hashem, which connects me to Hashem in a very special way, yes, of course I have to do all the mitzvahs. And of course every single mitzvah that I do connects me to Hashem. But also, I try to identify what is that mitzvah which I feel inside of me, I feel a calling towards that mitzvah. What is that one special mitzvah? Now, let's say my mitzvah is tzitzis, and let's say your mitzvah is
Chesed.
Is giving tzedakah. Why is your mitzvah tzedakah and my mitzvah tzitzis? Why not the other way around? And there is no answer to that question. There is no answer. If you look inside on page Kuf Yud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom, the Alter Rebbe says, "V'hine yisheno ir hazeh haprati l'neshamas pratius." This advantage that individual neshamas have, one over another. In other words, I have an advantage in this mitzvah, you have an advantage in that mitzvah. Einei b'bechinas tam v'das musig. It's not something which is logical. Elamayla me'bechinas hadas. It's beyond logic. Shekach ola b'machshava lefanav yisparach. This is what enters Hashem's machshava. We know that there are certain things that we don't understand because they are beyond our logic. And then there are certain things that the reason why we don't understand them is not because they're beyond our logic, but because they're beyond logic, period. When Moshe Rabbeinu, the Gemara describes in Masechtas Menachos, when Moshe Rabbeinu turns to Hashem and says, after witnessing, he was able to prophetically see what would be the fate, the tragic fate that would befall Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva. He was tortured to death, and Rabbi Akiva demanded of Hashem, Zu Torah, Zu Schara. Is this Torah? This is reward. And what does Hashem tell him? Shtoik kachala b'mashava, be quiet. This is what I have in my mind. And that wasn't that Hashem saying you're not smart enough to understand my reason, but you have to be quiet because there is no reason. This is my ratzon. There are certain things. An example of that in mitzvahs is the idea of para aduma. The essence of the mitzvah of para aduma is not something which just we don't understand. It's not understood. And the same thing over here. The association of a particular neshama with a particular mitzvah is something which is irrational. It's it goes beyond. It's higher than seichel.
So it's not bchira chofshit if according to this Hashem made each person to do with his special.
Hashem gave each person a certain.
It's not bechira chofshit.
Hashem gave each person a certain connection to a certain mitzvah. The person definitely has bechira chofshis, whether to do that mitzvah or not. And as we'll talk about it soon, actually sometimes our greatest difficulties in life are doing that one mitzvah, which is our special mitzvah. We'll talk about that soon. It doesn't mean that it's easy to do it. And Dr. Rebbe continues, "V'dugmasi lamato hu b'chinas hagirel mamish." An example over here in this world of when we're talking about something which is higher than logic is the lottery, a girl. If we all have a girl, why do I win and not you, or why do you win and not me? There is no logic to that. Is girl. So this portion that we have, our special portion in mitzvahs, in Torah, we also talk about the same chalkeinu b'seirasecha. The same idea applies in Torah. That every single one of us has our particular portion in Torah. Our connection to a certain area of Torah is the idea of goyrel. It's l'mayla mitam vadas. And every single morning when we daven, what do we say? Ashreinu, ma'tov chalkeinu, ma'noim goraleinu. You have to understand, we're not talking here only about the fact that in general I'm a Yid, and in general I have 613 mitzvahs.
We go around that way.
We're actually specifically talking about how fortunate we have the Geiraleinu, Chalkeinu, our portion, which is Geiraleinu, which doesn't make sense. But ultimately, the biggest simcha that I have is not only that I'm one of 600,000 of the Yidden, or for 14 million or 20 million, however many million Yidden there are, and all of us are part of an army. The greatest oisher, the greatest fortune is the understanding that actually I am unique and I have a unique connection to Hashem. I have a specific chelik. And that also answers a question that we asked earlier on in the Perek. We said that someone who does certain egregious averis, ein lo chelik b'elokei Yisrael, which means he forfeits his connection, his individual chelik. Remember, we asked, what does it mean? Chelik b'elokei Yisrael, what does it mean? Hashem isn't divided into portions. And the answer is yes. Of course Hashem isn't divided into portions, but that is as Hashem is in his essence. But as the divine energy enters the world, it actually does divide into 613 portions, and then it subdivides further. And we're thanking Hashem for Chalkeinu and Geraleinu. We're thanking for Hashem. Not only do I have Torah mitzvahs, but I have my unique niche, my unique area, and my unique and special connection to Hashem. And as we all know, there is that special feeling, there's that special Ashreinu, when we're able to identify something which is individually ours, something which is uniquely ours.
How do we know what's our Geralin and Chalkeinu?
So how do we know what's our Chalkeinu, what's our Geralinu? So Hashem did not put us here in the world to flounder in uncertainty. And therefore, Hashem does many things in order to make you aware of what your Chelek is. And I want to talk about three of them. Number one, there's this idea of Hashgacha Pratis. Hashgacha Pratis means that everything that happens is directed by Hashem.
Not accident.
Your surroundings, your environment,
Who did you meet?
your work area, who you meet, all of these are orchestrated by Hashem. We don't have choice in any of these areas. We'll talk about this a little more probably later on today. There's the idea of Hakol b'yedei Shamayim chutz mi'yirei Shamayim. All the circumstances are arranged by Hashem. Your choice is how to react to those circumstances, what your choices are in the face of the circumstances which you have. But the actual circumstances are all preordained and predestined by Hashem. So number one, there are a lot of clues sitting around you about what your unique avodah is. Look at yourself, look at your environment, what is needed of you. You don't have to look too far. You don't have to think, oh, maybe my job is to save the whales. Maybe the whales, they're becoming extinct. If Hashem wanted you to save the whales, he'd probably have had you born in Alaska, and maybe with a little more experience and knowledge in the whaling industry. The fact that you have no knowledge about it, again, I'm making an assumption about the people sitting here in the room, and there also are people who are listening from,
worldwide.
And maybe Taka, there's someone who's listening who says, okay, based on all the clues that Hashem put around me, maybe that is my job, is to save the whales. Ich weiß nicht. But Akapanim, for the people sitting over here in Flatbush in Brooklyn, it's a relatively fair assumption. So the first thing is, Hashem put you in a certain environment, and your question you have to ask is, looking around me, what is that? What do all my circumstances in my environment, what messages is Hashem telling me in terms of what my unique individual mission is and my unique individual mitzvah, which I should be zohir tfei. That's one idea. Another idea is that the mitzvah which is yours, and also, by the way, the chiluk and Torah that's yours. Remember, we spoke before about the same chokenu b'seir sacha. So the Gemara, we know the Gemara says, "La'elam yul meid adam memakim shali by chafetz." Everyone has a different desires, and you go back even in times of the Amiroim and Tanoim. So you have certain Tanoim who are experts in one area in Torah. And you have certain Amiroim who are, who's I think Rabbi Yehuda says that Kula Tnuye is in Seidin Ezikin. Rabbi Yehuda, his whole was Seidin Ezikin. Something another Mishnah somewhere, I forgot, talking about a certain Tana, talking about his expertise. The Tana, that was B'Makom Shali B'Chafetz, that was the area that the heart pulled them to. Your particular desires and your strengths. For example, some people have analytical minds. Okay, if you have a deeply analytical mind, then I think that's pointing you towards learning in a deeper way, learning more Le'iyun. Maybe you should be learning more Rabbarach Beres and Shimon Shkaps, if that's the kind of mind that you have.
That's right that you have.
It's not random. It's not, in other words, the koiches that you have and the talents that you have are not random. These are given by Hashem, and these are all arrows pointing you in the direction of what your specific area and mission in life are. Some people are not that way. Some people, I remember when I was back in a little while ago, I used to teach in a Mesivta, and there were some Bachrim, I would tell them, I want you to focus more on learning Shulchan Aruch, and more on learning Gemara Iggeres. So they didn't have, their minds weren't, that wasn't their forte, that wasn't their strength, is learning something in a very deep way, and they would get confused by the back and the forth of the Gemara. And I remember one of the Bachrim came to me many years later and thanked me and said that, remember that year I was there and you told me and I learned the whole Masechta Gemara, and I really enjoyed that. And they wasn't really enjoying the Gemara Le'iyun. And that's fine. No two people are the same, and the koiches that you have aren't random, and that's Le'elam Yul Meid Adam Mimakim Shali B'Chafetz. So, and the same thing is in terms of mitzvahs. We all have a certain desire, in other words, a certain geschmack and energy and enthusiasm in certain mitzvahs, and also certain strengths that lead us to certain mitzvahs. And those are all signposts from Hashem directing us in the area of Chalkeinu and Gerolenu, our particular portion. On the other hand, that mitzvah which is most important for us, and that area which is most important for us, is also the area which the Yetzer Hara tries the hardest to stop us from doing it. The best example of this is Adam and Chava. Adam and Chava, they had one mitzvah. One mitzvah. Don't eat the Chet Eitz Hadas. Now, and Adam and Chava they weren't simple people. They weren't Pashta people. And these were people who were created by the Eibishter himself. Yitzir Kapov Shel HaKodesh Baruch Hu. And not only did they have one mitzvah, but that mitzvah was only for a few hours. The Shach al HaTorah, the Shach writes, Shach al HaTorah is not the Shach on the Shulchan Aruch. It was a Makubal, was one of the Talmidim of the Arizal. The Shach al HaTorah writes, in Parshas Kedoshim, he writes that the whole Isser of the eating from the Chet Eitz Hadas was only going to be for a few hours. And then afterwards, in other words, think about it. Why did Hashem create the Eitz Hadas? Were we not supposed to eat from it? Then why did He create it? We're supposed to eat from it, but we're supposed to eat from it on Shabbos. Had they waited a few hours till Shabbos, I think of the way the Gemara describes it, they were created, I think, in the 9th hour, Adam and Chava. Had they waited Sachakel 3 hours, they would squeeze the grapes, because the Chet, especially according to Kabbalah, the Eitz Hadas was grapes, and they would have made Kiddush on that wine.
They know about it?
Apparently so. And for 3 hours, even us, even simple people like us, if we know we can't eat for 3 hours, something we desire very much, but I know that in 3 hours I'll be able to have it. You can hold yourself back. Why couldn't Adam and Chava hold themselves back? We judge them sometimes. A lot of times.
We're suffering.
Sorry?
Of that.
We have to die because.
Besides the fact that we are suffering because of that, it just seems ridiculous. Again, one mitzvah they lived in Gan Eden.
Yeah, to go to work.
And they were surrounded by anything they wanted, and by the trees, and what's the lush in the pasuk, and beautiful. everything they had and everything they wanted and everything they needed. He leaves the Gan Eden, and for 3 hours, man kann sich nicht einhalten. And by the way, this also, if you look at the rest of Jewish history, this plays itself out again and again, where you see people making mistakes and you can't understand.
Over and over.
You can't understand whether it's Avodah Zarah, whether it's this, whether it's that. And the key understanding that we have to have over here is that because Adam and Chava, because they had only one mitzvah, and that wasn't Stama mitzvah. The performance of that mitzvah was key for thousands of years afterwards. The whole power of the whole Yetzer Hara, of the whole Siter Achra, of the whole Satan was focused on that one mitzvah. So you're saying, yeah, if there's something I wanted to eat for 3 hours, I can push it off. But we all know how strong our Yetzer Hara is. Imagine if the entire power of our Yetzer Hara was galvanized and gathered and focused on one specific. Can any one of us say that we would be able to overcome that? That's a tremendous force.
They didn't
Now,
Yetzer Tov.
they also had a Yetzer Tov, and definitely that Bechira Chavshis, but we have to just understand the incredible force that was exerted against them. Again, I'm not denying that they had Bechira Chavshis, but it's putting it a little more in context, understanding why the Nisayin was such a difficult Nisayin, which is hard for us to imagine.
That was the first job from Yetzer Hara?
That was the first job of the Yetzer Hara. Yeah, Yetzer Hara didn't exist before then.
Yeah.
Now, think about that in our own lives also. The Yetzer Hara also has its priorities. Our own Yetzer Hara has its priorities. Some things doesn't fight so hard on. We all know in our own lives, right? It doesn't fight so hard on some things. And some things it fights hard. How do we do? Why is it fighting so hard for that? The letter from the Rebbe to someone, it's printed in the Rebbe's Iggeres HaKodesh, where the person wrote to the Rebbe about the problems that he's having in Shalom Bayis. The Rebbe writes to that person, I already told you about this and I warned you about this. I told you you're going to have difficulty in Shalom Bayis, because that's why your neshama is down here in this world. And therefore, your Yetzer Hara, because it recognizes that this is the most important thing for you, that's where it is doing its hardest to make sure that you should not be able to do it. But you should know this is your mission in this world, is Shalom Bayis, and therefore do your best, whatever you can, to make sure you have Shalom Bayis, because that's your purpose. Again, the moment that the Yetzer Hara identifies, it prioritizes, and no two people are the same. Because it looks at you and it said your mitzvah is this and your mitzvah is that, and that's where it puts its most koiches. So another signpost of where your particular chalkenu and geiralenu is looking at those areas which you find very difficult. And what's interesting is that very often these two things will come together. That a lot of times, if we look at ourselves, we'll realize the things that are hardest for us to do are the things that we're the best at. You'd think it should be the other way around. The things that I'm good at, the things that I'm naturally talented at, the things that my heart really has a feel for, a desire for, those should be easy for me. No, but we don't find that. To the contrary, sometimes you find a person that's very talented in a certain area, and that's the area where the Yetzer Hara puts and has a lot of koiches. And not only talented in koiches, the person actually enjoys it, but the Yetzer Hara is very, very tough against it. So there are many different signposts that tell us where our avodah is, and that is, but ultimately, every morning we wake up and we say, Ashreinu Matev Chalkeinu. I'm happy that I'm me and you're you. I'm happy that I have my chelik and you have your chelik, and I have my individual connection with Hashem, which is expressed in a particular mitzvah or a particular part of a mitzvah, which is my Zohir Tfei. Now, the Alter Rebbe over here also, he makes a big deal out of the fact that it's not only about from person to person, but also generation to generation. That different generations have different mitzvahs that are more important for that generation. Now this letter, Iggeres HaKodesh, as we mentioned, is a tzedakah letter. It's a letter where the Alter Rebbe is asking his chassidim to give tzedakah. But that whole part of the letter didn't make it, how do you say it was on the floor of the cutting, what's room?
Truncated.
There's a word for it, in the editing. It didn't make it in.
Maybe it was cut out, right?
Yeah. What is the part that is cut out? The Alter Rebbe finishes his letter by saying, Rabbi Yisai, the mitzvah of our generation is tzedakah. That's the connection. The whole thing the Alter Rebbe is talking about here is Ashreinu Matev Chalkeinu, telling us So that's true again at an individual level. It's also true on a generational level, that every generation has their own mitzvah which they have to be Zorit Fein, which they have to be particularly careful, and that's their avenue of connection to Hashem. And Alter Rebbe told his generation, he's telling them, you should know today it's tzedakah. Now that was interesting. It was taken out when it was printed, and the ones who printed the Iggeres HaKodesh, as mentioned, were big tzaddikim in their own right, including the son of the Baal Tanya, the Mittler Rebbe, Rabbi Dov Ber. And it would seem, I don't know this for sure, but it would seem that they felt that the larger idea of the letter is relevant for all generations. The larger idea is that every Yid has their own mission, and every generation has their own mission. But if they're going to go print that last letter of the Alter Rebbe, we're going to be sitting here 200 years later, and we're going to be saying, that our job is tzedakah, but maybe not, because that actually changes. That's something which changes with every single generation. Maybe that's the reason why they didn't include that part of the letter in here. Again, I'm not going to mix myself into the...
But it's a logical.
It's a logical...
What was the basis of that emphasis of tzedakah?
Sorry?
Why did the Alter Rebbe feel that was the emphasis? How did he know?
How did the Alter Rebbe know?
Yeah, how does he know
Never.
Okay. Well, how do you know what's the emphasis today? And the generation before and the generation... How did you determine that? It's a good fundraising letter, that I can tell you, that's for sure. I won't deny that.
I was trying to remember. I remember somewhere in Chumash where the Even Ezra, I'm trying to remember where it is. The Even Ezra asked a question about one of the Nevi'im. How did they know that?
Well, the Nevi'im got a nevuah.
And there's a pirush on the Kreis Gedolos of Even Ezra called Avi Ezri, or Avi HaEzri, I remember. And he writes over there that whoever asks this question isn't very smart. But he goes on and he's saying that the Even Ezra doesn't answer the question because it's so obvious he didn't even have to answer the question. But Al-Kapanim, how did Alter Rebbe know about it? Yeah, I guess he had his ways of knowing things.
What about today?
So today, again, first of all, as mentioned, the same way that we know what our avodah is as individuals, the same thing is also we can look around for the signposts which tell us what our avodah is as a generation. But actually, as a Lubavitcher Chassid, it's interesting to see how by the Rebbe it was very clear that at certain times, suddenly the Rebbe came out with a new thing.
I mean, Mivtzoyim.
So there were 10 Mivtzoyim. The Rebbe came out with 10 different Mivtzoyim. But each one of them was in a particular time. What he couldn't think of it all together. It was suddenly, maybe I'll add another mitzvah. And it was also when the Rebbe would come out with a new mitzvah, if you would follow the Rebbe's talks during that time, everything the Rebbe spoke about was about that mitzvah. In the Parsha, the Rebbe would be talking about that mitzvah. And the Rebbe was speaking about a Rashi. He'd find it would somehow or other would end up being talking about that mitzvah. And if he was talking about Rambam, it ended up talking about that mitzvah as always. And it's almost like the Rebbe was right now. This is the thing. This is the thing. And it seemed clear for those who were following that it wasn't just that the Rebbe was like, I had a great idea yesterday. Here's a good idea. It was much more about the Rebbe telling us about something about the time, more about the idea. It's not pshat that the Rebbe couldn't come up with the idea beforehand. But it was something, a generational thing, as if the Rebbe is saying, okay guys, now we're moving on to this. Now we have another Zohir. And now we have another Zohir. And that's, Al-Kapanim, that's the larger message, again, of this letter is the specialness that we have to know, knowing that our generation is unique and we have a unique mitzvah. And each one of us individually has a unique mitzvah. And that is what we're saying, Ashreinu Mativ Chalkeinu, for every single morning. And with that, we've concluded Siman Zayin in Iggeres HaKodesh. And now we will start Siman Ches. It's good timing.
That's also Hashgacha.
Right, not in the middle of this Siman, not in the middle of that Siman. It's perfect timing. Ben Perik Leperik, right? Ben Perik Leperik, yeah. Zereya Tzedakos Matzmiach Yeshuos. We say this in davening. And if you remember, we already talked about this a little in Siman Vav. If you look back at Siman Vav on page 218, it begins with the words Zeireya Tzedakah. And if you remember back over there, we asked the question, what does it mean Zeireya Tzedakah? What does it mean to plant tzedakah? Okay, poetically, kind of makes sense, because when you plant something, something grows from it. So
It's an investment. So
right.
You do stuff and you'll get a return on it.
Right, and also over there we explained how the idea of zuriya is, the idea of planting is that you take an apple seed and you put it into the ground, and the yield from that apple seed
It's tenfold.
is
Millionfold.
infinite-fold, theoretically infinite-fold, because this one seed can grow a tree, and which will grow fruit, another tree. It has the infinite power of growing, and it's not only quantitatively but also qualitatively. The seed is not edible, and what you're getting from it is beautiful, delicious fruit for many, many Rosh Hashanahs afterwards. The Alter Rebbe here again is going to ask, what does it mean, the connection between Zriya and Tzedakah? And in this letter, we're going to get a much more detailed response, or a much more detailed understanding of the connection between planting and tzedakah. Not only the general idea that when I plant, I'm getting a seed and I'm having a much greater harvest from it. There's actually many, many more parallels between Zriya and tzedakah, as we shall see. So this is a letter which the Alter Rebbe writes, and surprisingly, shockingly, the topic of this letter is tzedakah. And as will be Mirz Hashem, the next letter, where we get a bunch of letters about tzedakah coming up. This letter was written by the Alter Rebbe in the winter of the year Tavkuf Nun Zayin, so that would be either 1896 or 1897, because there's no exact date on it, and the winter spans the tomb. And interestingly, this letter was written, that means right around the time when Tanya was published. 17, I'm sorry. Yeah. Tavkuf Nun Zayin, either 1796 or 1797. The Tanya was first published on Chav Kislev Tavkuf Nun Zayin, Kislev. So this letter was written right around the time when Tanya was originally published. Now we know these letters, Iggeres HaKodesh, weren't published until close to 30 years later, after the Alter Rebbe passed away. But the first two parts of Tanya, Likutei Amarim, Tzarich V'Munu, were printed in that winter. And the Alter Rebbe writes this letter in this winter. This letter also, by the way, has been edited down for the purposes of Iggeres HaKodesh. In the original letter, the end contains a lot of technical details that the Rebbe includes over there about the fundraiser and how it's getting to Eretz Yisrael, and when exactly the money needs to be collected, and how it's supposed to be given to his emissaries, and that all was cropped for the purpose of Tanya, and instead we're having the limud part of it. So it begins again. We're talking about the idea of planting tzedakah, which causes the growth of Yeshuas, of salvation. The fact that we use the word zriya when talking about tzedakah, and also, it's not only we see this in davening, we see another pasuk, the pasuk says, Ziru lachem l'tzedakah, right? Plant for yourself tzedakah, which is interesting, right? Because as we mentioned, Alter Rebbe begins Siman Vav with another tzedakah, another pasuk, Zeriat tzedakah Secher Emes. I guess there's multiple references in the Torah to the idea of tzedakah being connected to Zriya, although it would be interesting to understand why the Alter Rebbe chooses to use over here the pasuk Ziru lachem l'tzedakah instead of the pasuk which he uses in the other letter, Zeriat tzedakah, but I don't know the answer to that question. But we have to understand why it is that tzedakah is called planting. So Yuvan, this will be understood al pi mash amar Razal, based on what Chazal tell us. The Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer, Yoiv pruta lo'ani v'hader matzli. Rabbi Eliezer would give a coin to a poor person, v'hader matzli, and afterwards he would daven. Why? Diksiv, because the pasuk says, Ani betzedek echaz epanecha. I, with tzedek, which also can mean tzedakah, echaz epanecha, I will envision your face, I will see your face. So seeing Hashem's face is during davening, and how do we do that? Betzedek, with tzedakah.
It's a pasuk where
Ani betzedek echaz epanecha? It's in Tillim. Esba b'hakitz t'munasecha. I don't remember which capital, but it's a pasuk in Tillim. Yeah. The ending of the pasuk is interesting because Ani betzedek echaz epanecha, I with tzedakah will see your face. Esba b'hakitz t'munasecha, I will satiate myself, bahokitz, while awake, tmunasecha, with your tmuna, with your picture, with your image. That's there's a story, a very famous story about the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek was the grandson of the Alter Rebbe, and he was raised by the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe had a daughter. Her name was Dever Leah, and she passed away very young. She passed away when the Tzemach Tzedek was 2 years old. This whole story, exactly how she passed away, she found out that there was a kitrug against the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe was meant to pass away. And she decided to take it upon herself, and she convened the Bezdin, and she told the Bezdin that I'm passing away instead of my father, and 3 days later she was gone. She passed away 3 days later on Sem Gedalia. And Erev Rosh Hashanah was when she made the Bezdin. Sem Gedalia, she passed away, and the Alter Rebbe raised this young Menachem Mendel with Tzemach Tzedek. He raised him. Now the Tzemach Tzedek was the third Rebbe in other words, when the Alter Rebbe passed away, so his son, the Mittel Rebbe, became the Rebbe. The Rebbe passed away in 1812. The son became the Rebbe, but his son didn't lived until Tavkuf Pei Ches, which is 1827, and then the Tzemach Tzedek became the Rebbe. Now, upon him, the story is told about the Tzemach Tzedek. I'm not sure whether it was when he was the Rebbe. Maybe it was even before he was the Rebbe. Maybe this was still while his father-in-law and uncle, because the Mittel Rebbe was his father-in-law and his uncle, was the Rebbe, that it happened a while that he did not see the Alter Rebbe in a dream. And he was used to seeing the Alter Rebbe in his dreams, Tzemach Tzedek. And he used to ask, when he had questions, he used to ask questions to the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe would respond to his questions. And a while had gone by, he had not seen the Alter Rebbe in a dream, and he was very, he was despondent about that. He was wondering why he wasn't being Zoicha to see the Alter Rebbe. And one morning he's on the way to Shul. The Tzemach Tzedek is on the way to Shul, and he gets stopped by a butcher. And that day was the day of the market in the city, in Lubavitch. And the butcher asked, because the Tzemach Tzedek, he had I don't know if he had an official free loan fund or he used to lend out money by himself. One way or another, he said, can I borrow some money because I would like to buy a cow so that I can make some parnasa. Tzemach Tzedek says, sure, I'm just on the way to Shul. Why don't you stop by my house in like an hour and I'll gladly give you the money. Tzemach Tzedek goes to Shul and he's about to start davening, and he thinks to himself, I'm making that Yid wait for an hour. Who knows, in that hour he could be doing business, and he could be, that's his parnasa. So he took off his talus and he ran home, and he got the money, and he went to market and found him, and he gave him the money. And he went back to Shul, and as he put his talus over his shoulder to make the bracha, suddenly the Alter Rebbe revealed himself to him, behokitz. Behokitz. Espa behokitz tmunasecha. Ani b'tzedek echza panecha espa behokitz. He saw the Alter Rebbe for the first time in a while, and the Alter Rebbe answered him the questions that he had. An interesting connection to that pasuk. So what is the connection between giving tzedakah and davening? And by the way, also in Hayom Yom, the Rebbe writes that the Rebbe Rashab, before he davened, he would try to find a poor person to give him something to eat. And sometimes he would be in the morning, be wandering around the city of Lubavitch looking for a poor person to be able to give some food to before davening.
What's wrong with the charity box?
I don't think the Gaboim of 120 years ago are the same as the Gaboim today. I don't think they were 24/7 attached to the hip like they are today. Yeah. You know, there are different types of tzedakah. There's a mashpia in Crown Heights, and there's a mashpia in 770 today. Someone told me that he remembers years ago that it was a night of Hanukkah, and he comes home and he lived in the same, it was one of the nights of Hanukkah, and he's living in the same building as that person, and he sees that he's standing in front of the building and he's pacing back and forth. And say, yes, what is it? He says that I need to light my menorah, but before I light the menorah, I want to find another Yid to light the menorah with. A Yid who hasn't had a chance to light the menorah. And the Rebbe, we know, kochzach very much in helping other Yid doing mitzvahs, and he didn't want to go light his own menorah before he had found a Yid who can light the menorah with. That's a tzedakah ruchnis. But there's this idea of giving tzedakah before davening. And what's the connection? So on a very simple level, it makes sense. And that is that we're coming to Hashem and we're telling Hashem that I want you to fulfill my needs. We're asking We're asking Hashem for das. We're asking Hashem for parnasa. We're asking Hashem for refuas, for yeshuas, whatever it may be. But why should Hashem listen to us? So essentially, what are we going to come and ask Hashem for? We're going to ask Him for tzedakah. Which one of us is arrogant enough to come to Hashem and say, Hashem, I deserve this? Even Moshe Rabbeinu. V'eschanan al Hashem. So what are Chazal saying? That tzaddikim, when they ask Hashem, they ask for amat naschinam. They ask for, they don't come, right? They don't come and say, hey, I deserve it and I'm so great. And Allah achas kama v'kama, we're not Moshe Rabbeinu. So we're asking Hashem for tzedakah. L'cho Hashem tzedakah, right? So if we're asking Hashem for tzedakah, so we should give tzedakah beforehand. If we'll give tzedakah to a poor person, then Hashem will give tzedakah because we're also poor, each one of us in our own way. That's a Balabatish answer, and it's correct. But the pasuk over here, Va'ani b'tzedek echze panecha, tells us something else. Because if the reason why you're giving tzedakah is about the way I just described it, then you're giving tzedakah to ensure the result of davening. But ani b'tzedek echse panecha doesn't mean that through tzedakah I will cause that my davening will bring about incredible results. No. Echze panecha, the experience of davening, the ability to be able to experience Hashem, is a result of giving tzedakah.
So what's the connection?
The ability to daven and experience davening in a real way comes through tzedakah. Not that if I daven, if I give tzedakah, Hashem will fulfill my prayers, fulfill my davening. No, there's something deeper going on over here. And that's really what we have to understand, is what is the connection between tzedakah and the ability to echze panecha, to really be able to daven properly, and to be able to daven in a way of echze panecha. So this letter is going to once again reinforce. We had another letter beforehand, Siman Daled in Iggeres HaKodesh, where the Alter Rebbe spoke about the idea of davening and why we have to give tzedakah before davening. The Alter Rebbe speaks over there about Ein Yisrael Negolin Ela b'tzedakah, and the Geula on a daily basis. What is the Geula that we experience as davening? Davening is the Geula moment of the day, and just like tzedakah, it brings about the Geula for the reasons the Alter Rebbe explains over there. The same thing is also if we want to experience our individual Geula. For that we need to daven. For that we need to give tzedakah also. So if you want to daven and experience the Geula of davening, the Geula of your nefesh alikis during davening, so that was one idea. But here the Alter Rebbe is going to focus on a different idea. But the idea that's emerging from not only this letter, not only that letter, but many of the letters, is that, we spoke earlier, you spoke about choices, right? The choices that we make, and what those choices that are predetermined. We know that Hakol b'dei Shamayim chutz mi'yirei Shamayim. There's a joke that I probably said in the past about there was a couple, a husband and a wife, and they had great shalom bayis. That's not the joke yet. And one day someone comes to them and says, "You've married for 30 years, such incredible shalom bayis. Tell me, what's the secret?" The guy says, "I'll tell you, it's right in the beginning of marriage, we sat down one day and we realized the problem is, why do people get into fights when they're married? Is because he says, she says, he decides one way, she decides another way, and then they get into a fight. Who gets their way? We decided we have to make a division of duties. Certain decisions I make, certain decisions she makes, and we stay out of each other's domain. So we decided I'm going to make all the big decisions and she's going to make all the small decisions, and since then, Shalom al Yisrael, everything is great." He says, "Really? Wow, that's amazing." He says, "What are the big decisions? What are the small decisions?" He says, "I make the big decisions. I decide who should be the next president of the United States. I decide what our policy should be about the Iran nuclear deal. I decide, whether the stimulus package is good for the economy or bad for the economy. And whatever I decide, that's in the house, that's the decision." She makes the small decisions. She decides what's going to be for supper tonight, where the kids are going to go to school, the healthcare, all these small little things that are just local to her, Many of us in life, we're busy making the big decisions, but they're out of our hands. They're out of our hands. So we're busy. How many times did Rebbe screamed about people who are sitting and reading the newspapers about what's going on in Washington? It makes a difference. You know about it, you know, but don't know about it. Is it going to make any difference? Why are you wasting your time? Sit down and learn some Torah. It's not just pshat that it's not a good thing, it's a bad thing. It's a useless thing. It's a useless thing. And we're using up our brain power to develop opinions and all of these things. It's a waste. You have to know what is in my control and what isn't in my control. And that which is not in control is dvarim b'telem, it's a waste of time. But even more than that, even in our own lives, which we think we do control, many of the things that we think control, we don't control either. So you think that you're so smart, you decided where to live. No. The Gemara says that 40 days before you're born, it's already decided where you're going to live and who you're going to marry, right? You decided you're going to get married. No, you think you decided. The Eibishter arranged it, orchestrated it. The parnasa that you have, everything is preordained. Everything that happens is preordained, including everything that you're going to do. What isn't preordained? Is Yiras Shamayim. Will I do what the Eibishter wants me to? Or will I not do what Hashem will I not do? That's the realm of my choice. Which is sad because so many of us got distracted making decisions which anyways we're really not making. Which anyways, these decisions have been made for us before we were born. We're not going to cause any change in them, and we're investing our time and energy. And how am I going to? I'm spending 13 hours a day figuring out how to make some more money. But in Rosh Hashanah was already decided how much money you're making this year. You're wasting your time. Yeah, you have to go to work because the bracha of the Eibishter comes. There has to be the tasa. You have to make a keli for the bracha of Hashem, but don't overdo it. The mashal is brought down in Chassidus. The bracha is like the levush. The work that you do is the levush. It's the garment into which the keli or the levush, into which Hashem's bracha can come. And what if you have a garment which is too big? If your pants are too long, you trip over them. If the keli is too big, it could also be a problem. In other words, you have to make a keli, but don't overdo it either, right? So, however, where does a yid focus on? A yid focuses on Yiras Shamayim, doing mitzvahs, davening, learning, fighting the Yetzer Hara. And these areas we think, here, it's all me. The Eibishter doesn't get involved over here. If I need a refuah, I know I need to go to the Eibishter for that. Any parnasa, it's the Eibishter. But whether or not I'm going to do a mitzvah, whether I'm not going to daven like a gishmak davening, like a yid davens, whether I'm able to learn Torah and have atzlach and learn that Torah, this is a kol b'dei Shamayim, chutz from Yiras Shamayim, and this is part of Yiras Shamayim. But as we're seeing, it's not so pashut. We're seeing from these parakim that we need help in our avodas Hashem also. The pasuk says about that when a person makes too much, the Chassid Shalom says, "Koichi v'oitzim yadi asali sachai lazeh." To a certain extent, that's true also by ruchnius and ruchnius the katemis. That it's foolish to think that even your spiritual ruchnius the kakabas are koichi v'oitzim yadi. We need help from the Eibishter. And one of the things that we've encountered again and again is how tzedakah helps us in our avodas Hashem in many different areas. And again, this is something that we see in davening so many times. We ask, we're asking the Eibishter for help in our avodas Hashem. We do that all the time. Even in the Tzmei we ask the Eibishter to help us do tshuva, all of these things. But ultimately, one of the biggest helps in all areas of avodas Hashem is giving tzedakah. And that's important to know, that in avodas Hashem also we have to ask Hashem for help, and don't be so arrogant to think that you can today DIY is the big thing, right? You know what DIY stands for? No one here knows what DIY stands for.
Do it yourself.
Do it yourself, right? You type in, you go to Google and type in anything DIY. How do I do this myself? I don't need the expert. I don't need help. Today the thing is DIY. I work for a JLI, the organization, and we put out for every single Yom Tov a DIY handbook on the Yom Tov. How to do the Yom Tov by yourself. Because of COVID, a lot of people also weren't going to shul, so we put out these handbooks, the DIY. How to shake a lulav and esrog by yourself. So we could think that Yiddishkeit is DIY. Right? Listen, it's not DIY. We always need siyata d'shmaya. And one of the biggest ways that we get siyata d'shmaya is by giving tzedakah. Now, this is true in all areas, but there's a special truth when it comes to davening. And to explain why, I want to say a story which I know I've said in the past. Maybe some of you have heard it, but you'll humor me anyways, even Ruven, right? Don't interrupt me and give away the end of the story. So don't interrupt and give away the end of the story, even though I know you've heard the story a few times from me. It's a good story. The Mezritch Magid, Reb Doiv Ber, the Rebbe Ber of Mezritch. So he became a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, but he didn't start off life as a chassid. In fact, it probably would have been hard for him to start life as a chassid, considering that many historians believe that he was born before the Baal Shem Tov. Many historians believe we don't know exactly when he was born, but there are those who surmise that he was older than the Baal Shem Tov, even though he eventually became a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov. But even before he became a chassid, he was an incredible goyin, and not only a goyin in Nigla, but also in Nistar, in Kabbalah. I think it's brought down about him that there was no printed book in Nigla or Nistar that he hadn't gone over, I think maybe 200 times. I don't remember the number, but he was very, very well versed in Nigla and Nistar. And by the way, that there were many of the non-Hasidim who were very well versed in Nistar. It wasn't only something. The difference is by the Alter Rebbe was of the opinion that everyone should be learning Nistar, and he printed Tanya and his Hafatzas Hamayanis, the idea of everyone. Whereas in other circles, to learn Nistar, you had to have been a very big goyin in the first place. But the Vilna goyin was a big opponent of the Alter Rebbe's. He was an incredible mekubal. Not only was he goyin in Nigla, but he was incredible mekubal. So you had many of the greatest misnagdim were very, very familiar with Kabbalah, and he was one of them. It's a whole story how he became a chassid of the Baal Shem Tov. We're not going to go into that right now. But he was davening. Suffice it to say that even before he came to the Baal Shem Tov, when he davened with the kavanas of the Arizal. And he had a chavrusa with whom he had studied all the kavanas of the Arizal, and they would daven with the kavanas of the Arizal. So they would daven for a considerable amount of time, because in your mind, at every point in davening, they're busy thinking the different kavanas of the Arizal. Anyways, the Magid became a chassid, and then he became a Rebbe. And his chavrusa, with whom he had learned all the Kabbalah, didn't become a chassid. The story rings a bell by Yeruven. No.
Who was his chavrusa?
The story doesn't come with a name. One day the chavrusa says, "You know what? Let me go visit the Magid. I'm hearing great things about him. He's become a big leader. And I know he's a great person. They knew him from years back. Time to go and meet him again." So he travels to the Mezritch and he meets the Magid, and they catch up on old times. I'm sure they spoke in Torah. And then it comes time to daven. They both get up to daven, and they're both davening barichas, because they're both davening the kavanas l'Arizal. But the Magid davened much longer than his chavrusa. The Magid finished davening, so the chavrusa says, "Listen, you want to pull the wool over the eyes of your Hasidim. I get that. You want them to think that you're a very holy person. But me,
Who are you kidding?
You're not kidding me. We learned together the kavanas of the Arizal. I daven with the kavanas of the Arizal. I know exactly how long it takes to go through your head the kavanas of the Arizal. I know exactly how long you take it to daven. So for me, you don't have to put on the show." Okay, the Maggid didn't respond. But later on, in the course of the conversation, the Maggid says, "Tell me a little about yourself. What's going on? How do you make parnasa?" He says, "Parnasa, I have a store, but my wife runs the store. I don't, because I'm busy learning Torah the whole day." She says, "You don't work at all?" He says, "Yeah. Once or twice a year, I have to go to the big city. I have to go to Leipzig, which is where the fair is, and over there, I have to buy the schroed, I have to buy the merchandise, and then I bring it home to my wife, and she unpacks it and she sells it for the next long while." So the Maggid says, "Describe for me your trip." So he says, "I live in the city, and I rent a wagon, and I get a wagon driver. I only drive a few hours a day because I can't really learn well on the wagon, so I only do a few hours of traveling. Then I stop off in the city and go to the shul, and I sit and learn for a few hours. So it takes me probably around a week to get where I need to go. And then once I'm in Leipzig, I go to this store, and to that warehouse, and to that sucker, to that merchant, and I gather all my things, go back home. It's a 2-3 week process, the whole thing." I guess it's 2-3 weeks. And even though you stop and you learn a lot, that's very disruptive of your schedule. I have an idea for you. I have an idea for you in the future. Instead of going to Leipzig, sit down in your room, in your house. Close the door. Think, right now I'm renting the carriage. And right now the driver is driving me to the next city. And now I'm getting off the wagon and I'm learning a little. Okay, now it's the next day. So now I'm getting into the wagon and we're moving on to the next city. Okay, fast forward. And then now I'm getting to Leipzig. Now I'm going to this merchant. I'm stacking my wagon, traveling back. And by the way, in a half an hour, the whole trip is finished. The guy looks at the Maggid like he's nuts. He's like, maybe what people are saying about Chassidim really is true. He says, I can't do that. Maggid says, why not? He says, I won't have the schleira. It's all in my head. I won't have the merchandise. So Maggid says, the same thing is when it comes to davening. In your mind, you're like, okay, now we're holding by Psuki the Zimros, and now I'm in the world of Yitzhak. And now we're by Birchas Krishma, now I'm in the world of Bria. And now I'm here, I'm there. But you're not anywhere, it's all in your head. You don't have the schleira. To actually experience the kavanas of the Arizal, that takes time. And that's why it takes me longer than you to daven. Because by you, it's all in your head. And by me, I'm actually experiencing what's going on. And to make that journey, have that experience, it takes more time. Ani b'tzedek echeze panecha. Davening is called echeze panecha. It's called experiencing, seeing panecha, the panim of Hashem, the innerness of Hashem. A deep level, it's connecting with a very deep level of Hashem. In a way of echeze, in a way of re'iyah, in a way of experiencing and seeing it. Davening is not about that's what I'm looking for. It's not a figment of your imagination. A real davening is a real experience. There's a real gilui going on, and you have the ability to connect to and attach to something which is very real. And for that you need tzedakah. For the echze panecha, for that you need tzedakah. Why? So let's look inside, page 224. 5 lines from the top. Pirush, this means Ki gilui elikus yizbarach, the gilui elikus hamizgala b'machshavti shel adam v'kavanase b'tfilase, which is revealed in the thoughts of a person and in his kavana while davening. Kol echad lefum shira delay, everyone experiences it in their own way. U'b'teira tzedakah v'chesed Hashem ma'olam v'ad olam al yirei chulu. It's a tzedakah and a chesed of Hashem, which comes down from higher worlds to the lower worlds and is experienced by Yireyav, by those who are in awe of Hashem. So we're already making connections over here. You want to know why you need to give tzedakah before davening? Because the experience of davening is tzedakah. For you to be able to experience Hashem in a way of echze panecha during davening is tzedakah. And why that is, we'll learn in Mitzvah Hashem next week. Why it's called tzedakah. But you notice over here that the Rebbe uses the words Kol echad lefum shiura delay, everyone according to their madrega. And this connects also to this week's parsha. This connects to this week's parsha, and what we learned in the last page connects to next week's this week's parsha on a very, very simple level, without going too deep. The parsha begins with Baal Shem Tov Library, with lighting the menorah. The menorah, as we know, represents Klal Yisrael. And the menorah has 7 branches. Why does it have 7 branches? Because there are 7 different types of neshamas. There are certain neshamas that their ikar avodah is chesed. Some neshamas their ikar avodah is gevura. Some their ikar avodah is teferes, etc. And ultimately we're miksha achas. Ultimately we're one menorah. One menorah busy lighting up the world with the light of Torah, with the light of Hashem. And on the Beis HaMikdash, the windows of the Beis HaMikdash were different than the standard windows. In the olden times, windows were made in a way that they were narrow on the outside and wider on the inside, so the light should be able to come in and be able to diffuse throughout the entire room. In the Beis HaMikdash, the windows were the opposite way. They were narrow on the inside, wider on the outside, because the Beis HaMikdash doesn't need light from the outside. The whole world was lit up by the light of the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash, and what was the light of the Beis HaMikdash? Was the menorah. And ultimately, what is the menorah? The menorah is Klal Yisrael. And we're Miksha Achas, we're one piece of gold. All of Klal Yisrael together, we're one piece of gold, which is, reminds us of what we learned the last week or 2 weeks ago. We learned this idea that all of Yidden were all started off in the neshama of Adam Rishon. We're all one person. That's really the source of the idea of Avos Yisrael, is that we're all one. We're all one. It's not. That's why when we have that perspective, it really changes Avos Yisrael. We're not doing each other's favors. Like when your head is itching, and you scratch your head, is your hand doing your head a favor? Does it say thank you? And let's say if you see someone, a rock is flying in your direction, is your hand going to say to your head, sorry, I'm not going to hurt myself to protect you? That's your problem, not mine. I'm good. No, your hand, because we're one. Klal Yisrael, we're one. We're Miksha Achas, we're one. We're one body, we all come from the sing of the neshama of Adam Rishon. But at the same time, what?
The Goyim also come from Adam Rishon.
No. We spoke about this last week. The Goyim, they were not included in the neshama of Adam Rishon before the Chet. They were added on afterwards. You have the famous Rashi where Rashi says, Kol HaNefesh Haba, right? When the Shivim Nefesh, it calls them Nefesh. And when Esav goes down to Lashon Yachid, when Esav goes down to and the Parsha of Yishlach, it talks about the Nafsheis Beisei, even though it was much less.
That's in Vayishlach.
The Nefesh is in Vayigash, and the Nafsheis Beisei is in Vayishlach. Yeah, so it's in Rashi, I believe in Vayishlach, where Rashi makes that comparison. But it's a little of a digression from what we're talking about. So ultimately we're Miksha Achas, but just even though we're Miksha Achas, ultimately we're 7 different branches. Each one of us is unique and has a unique way. So B'chlolos as Klal Yisrael, we're divided into 7 nefashos, which is 7 different types of neshamas. But every single one of us also, as we learned, has the Zahir Tfei. We each light up the world in our own individual way. There's our own B'mayvi Zahir Tfei. And this is experienced very, very much so when it comes to davening. Other mitzvahs that we do are more or less, I put on tefillin, you put on tefillin. Right? She lights Shabbos candles, she lights Shabbos candles. I blow shofar, you blow shofar. I hear Megillah, you hear Megillah. But davening, which is Avodah Shabalev, is one area we talk about, in the words of Alter Rebbe over here, Kol Chad L'fum Shura Delay. Davening and the experience of Hashem is done in a unique way, and no two Yidden are the same. And even though we have the same Nusach HaTfilah, but if you're really having an Echzeh Panecha experience, if you're really experiencing Hashem, it's a unique experience. I saw recently a good mashal for this. That davening is like a Hallmark card. You know what the Hallmark card is, Reuven? You ever went to the store? The cards. You can get a birthday card, an anniversary card, a get well soon card, right? A lot of different cards. So imagine you get a gift someone, you buy the card and you give the card without writing anything in it. May as well save the $2 or $3 and not get the card. If you're not going to put in anything, right? So if you need a personal card, then why? If you need to do personal, why are you getting the card? So the answer is you buy a card. The card has a bunch of words in there, and that gets you started. And then you add your personal touch. Davening is the same way. Davening is those words. The beautiful words. And then you have to add your personal touch. This idea of by davening, everyone has to have Kol Chad L'fum Shura Delay. You have to realize davening has to be personal. It has to be unique. It has to be with your branch of the menorah, and that's when you get the Echzeh Panecha. And Mirz Hashem, next week we will discuss why is it that this Echzeh Panecha is a tzedakah, and why it is that our tzedakah is what brings it about.